Hey everybody, two Alpha Gals here. I'm Debbie Nichols.
And I'm Candace Mathis, and you're listening to In the Tall Grass, where we're sharing stories of reinvention, resilience, and rediscovering joy.
Whether it's facing Alpha Gal syndrome or any other redefining chapter of life, we all have to learn how to navigate the journey through the tall grass. So here we go.
So before we get started, we want to share that our brand new Alpha Gal 101 resource guide is now available. We spent the last few years condensing our most valuable tips and tricks for navigating this crazy condition. You'll find everything from the basics to dealing with some of the more complicated aspects of Alpha Gal syndrome. And we hope it helps ease the overwhelm that comes with this diagnosis.
You can find our all-new resource guide on our website, twoalphagals.com. That's TWOalphagals.com. And for a limited time, use code TALLGRASS, all one word, TALLGRASS, to save $3.
Hello, everyone. We're here today with Dr. Sarah McGill, gastroenterologist at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Hello, Dr. McGill. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Hi, Debbie. Hey, Candace. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We're excited. We've got lots of good questions for you. We know that our listeners are going to really enjoy hearing what you have to say. But we'd love to start by asking you to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I'm an adult GI doctor at UNC. I have training in both kind of research, patient-based research, and of course, medicine. And I practice general gastroenterology. I do colonoscopies, endoscopies, and I see patients in the clinic with GI symptoms.
That's awesome. And we are so grateful for all the work that you are doing to kind of encourage more of the research into the GI variant of Alpha Gal syndrome. So we would love to kind of dig into that a little bit. And can you share with us what made you start to put the connection together between your IBS patients and Alpha Gal syndrome?
So really, it started with a single patient who had gotten sick twice from red meat, and she remembered what she had eaten, and she woke up in the middle of the night. So it was like this one classic case that I probably will never see again, because usually they're not that perfect. But with diagnosing that first case, it raised awareness, and I remember looking at the kind of the Google of literature, medical literature, trying to find information on this GI variant, and I didn't find it. So I knew there was not much out there, but I kept testing people, and I kept diagnosing people more frequently than I was diagnosing other kind of known GI illnesses like celiac disease or Crohn's disease. I was diagnosing alpha gal allergy actually more commonly than I was diagnosing those things.
Oh. That's kind of a wild statistic to think about, that you were diagnosing that more. Lots of us saw the recent piece by NPR, which addressed some of the work that you're doing with alpha gal syndrome or the alpha gal mammalian allergy. In that piece, it mentioned that you had developed new guidance for the American Gastroenterological Association regarding the GI-Only Onset. Can you tell us more about this guidance?
Right. So the American Gastroenterological Association asked myself and Jana Hashash and Thomas Platts Mills to write this article, really just explaining what alpha gal syndrome is, how it can manifest with GI symptoms alone without, the classic anaphylaxis or chronic urticaria, and then also how to manage it for gastroenterologists. The point of the guidance was to increase awareness about alpha gal allergy among gastroenterologists, because we think it's largely undiagnosed among the people with GI symptoms.
So to that, have you gotten a lot of feedback from other GI specialists now that that's come out? I'd love to know kind of what you're hearing within the community.
I would love to say that a bunch of gastroenterologists have written me excited about alpha-gal syndrome, but really I've gotten a lot of emails from patients that are excited that have alpha-gal syndrome that may have gone undiagnosed for many years. They're the ones who are really excited about this. And I haven't been out much yet. It's just been like a month since that was published, but our big GI conference is coming up, and I'll be interacting with a lot of gastroenterologists and thought leaders, throughout the US. So I'm interested in what they will say.
We'll be interested to hear what they have to say too. It's neat to hear that patients are excited about it. Sometimes I catch myself when we're talking about our community and people living with alpha-gal syndrome and wanting people to be diagnosed, right? It's not that we want people to be diagnosed. We don't want there to be more people with alpha-gal syndrome, but having gone so long living with symptoms that were undiagnosed, the diagnosis itself comes with a lot of relief.
Right. I think that's what I'm hearing from the patients. Like, let's bring this out to the medical community so patients don't have to live for a long time without knowing what's wrong with them.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's huge. I mean, we need our medical, we go to our medical professionals for care and advice and guidance, and we need them to kind of have this on their radar. And we're just so thankful that it's finally, you're helping to pioneer this, as education among providers. And so speaking about patients, what recommendations or advice do you have for patients that are wanting to speak with their GI provider about getting tested for alpha-gal syndrome if they're still symptomatic, if they have IBS or
Right.
another GI condition? Do you have any certain advice for them going into their GI?
I mean, if they have irritable bowel syndrome and they're still symptomatic on management, diarrhea predominant irritable bowel syndrome, we haven't seen a lot of constipation, or if they're having recurrent nausea, vomiting episodes, basically the symptoms that we've seen the most are diarrhea, abdominal pain, nausea, vomiting, recurrent, not just like a one-time thing, but recurrent or chronic symptoms, then I would just recommend to flat out ask to get screened for alpha-gal syndrome and get an alpha-gal IgE antibody, especially if they've had a tick bite or live in the Southeast or Mid-Atlantic or Midwest states, which is kind of the alpha-gal prevalent region. And, if their doctor says, I have no idea what you're talking about, which certainly may happen, because I still think that it's unknown to a lot of providers. Actually, we had the pleasure of hosting the president of the American Gastroenterological Association at UNC, and he gave a wonderful talk on colon cancer. And I got to meet him briefly, and I asked him, have you ever heard of alpha-gal syndrome? And he hadn't. So I think most doctors won't have, most gastroenterologists won't have. So it will be kind of maybe a educational experience maybe for the doctor.
Are you comfortable with those educational experiences from the perspective of a medical professional, of a doctor? Are you comfortable if a patient comes to you and says, hey, I did this research on something that looks like my symptoms, and I mean, it never hurts to say, oh, by the way, I have this lovely piece of guidance that was published. But
that will definitely be helpful. I'm definitely open. When patients send me things like, let's say, acupuncture for irritable bowel syndrome, I want to think about that too and read about it. And certainly, not everything is welcome because there's a lot of stuff on the internet, but actually, I'm open to it, and I hope other doctors are as well, especially with
alpha-gal. Is that what you said?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And I want to go back and ask you specifically about your observations with some of your patients. Even at 2 alpha-gals, we're constantly digging into alpha-gal information. We're constantly inundated with things that people are sending us.
Mm-hmm.
And as familiar as we're trying to get with it, it still seems that alpha-gal syndrome is very dynamic and unpredictable. There's the delayed reaction, the range in allergens. One person's allergic to one thing that another person isn't. You've got the range in severity. For example, me personally, I didn't originally eliminate dairy, but then I continued to have some symptoms. So I did, and I felt better. And then my first exposure to dairy after that, several months later, was anaphylactic. So I saw the severity of my own reactions change. Have you noticed an evolution of the allergy in any of your patients that have presented to you as GI only, but have shifted to include other reaction symptoms?
I do have one patient who was just GI only and diagnosed, got off of meat, actually didn't feel better for a while, but she was cooking all of her vegetables in lard, so figured that out. And then her, after the diet and after feeling better for several months, she decided to re-challenge herself, and she did have anaphylaxis. It wasn't severe. It was skin symptoms, rash, and also her GI symptoms. So I have had that one patient, but that's too bad to hear about your experience, because we hope and pray that patients go the other way. They get less symptomatic over time, but you're proof that the other can happen.
It can, but I'm also hopeful that, once I've got this completely out of my system, I've got all this stuff removed from my diet. It's been a while since I've had any exposure, as far as I know, that it will start shifting in that direction. And it's been nice, doing this with Candace, where we are learning the ins and outs of how to live this way. And so it's not as intimidating to think that even if I had to live this way forever, I'd be all right. I can think of worse things,
Yeah, it becomes that way. And Debbie and I talk a lot about this, and I know Dr. McGill, you're not immunology, but we've been curious to know, and I guess see, like Dr. Common's research as it grows. I have an autoimmune disease too, so we didn't fit into the GI variant only. We kind of started out a little more reactive than most of your patients. So I'll be curious to see what the research shows as time goes on, if there's maybe a link to more complex cases like mine, that it tends to just be more severe than maybe someone else.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. So that's just my observation right now, but we'll see. We'll see. So we'd love to kind of go back to your guidance. And one thing, we pulled a quote out from your guidance, and would love to dig into this just a little bit with you. So one of the quotes was, most individuals with alpha-gal antibodies in the population are asymptomatic and tolerate mammalian meat ingestion, but the consequences of continued mammalian meat intake among these sensitized individuals are unclear. Recent studies have suggested that this may affect the heart by driving mast cell activation in coronary arteries, leading to coronary artery disease. So if there is a risk that a patient has alpha-gal syndrome, and even if they're asymptomatic, should they be tested to avoid coronary disease? And okay, so we have like 3 parts to this question. So let's start with that one.
Well, first of all, I mean, doesn't that blow your mind? Like, we've known that mammalian meat is a risk factor for coronary artery disease for a long time. And, alpha-gal syndrome was first described in people who are asymptomatic from meat ingestion. It was first described really in people who got anaphylaxis with cetuximab. And it wasn't just like 1 or 2 people. It was 1 out of every 5 people in the Southeast and Midwest who were getting the cetuximab. So I think your question is really, should we just be screening everyone for alpha-gal syndrome, especially in prevalent regions? Because could this drive coronary artery disease, knowing that most people will actually be asymptomatic when they eat meat? But could this have these effects? And I think it's a great question. I don't have the right answer for you. I mean, personally, I actually I need to screen. I want to screen myself, because I want to know and have to, make that decision. There's two sides of the coin. Like, we don't want people freaking out and anxious and, driving anxiety or depression about this diagnosis if it's really not causing any problems asymptomatically. But on the other hand, if it is causing problems, then we want people to know. I mean,
Is a part of the research that I'm just curious is there a time frame that these people like become diagnosed with the coronary heart disease? Are they older patients?
These two studies that saw this correlation, they were both studies in people who were getting their coronary arteries visualized by some radiology procedure. One was an intravascular ultrasound, and the other one was, I think, CT angiography. So they were both kind of radiologic studies of the coronary arteries, and these groups of patients who were getting their arteries analyzed, they had their alpha-gal titers run kind of like after kind of post-hoc, after they had gotten this imaging. And the researchers noted that the people who had alpha-gal antibodies had more kind of aggressive coronary artery disease. So it's an association. It's not exactly like a cause and effect, but it's very intriguing.
It is.
The GI alpha-gal stuff, we almost have the cause and effect stories of patients without the association studies, because GI symptoms are so common, and then alpha-gal antibodies are so common that we did a study where those actually weren't associated. But on the other hand, we have these cause and effect patient stories that are very compelling that this does exist.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, we were just talking man, then primary care physicians, need to know about this to possibly, I don't know what it takes to add that to the routine. Does that get added under a CBC? At what point does it get added as a routine blood draw?
I mean, I can tell you with the example of celiac disease, which is also considered a food allergy. Like my mother, she probably had celiac disease when I was growing up. She was very iron deficient. She would always be eating ice. She was only diagnosed with celiac in her 60s when she developed a rash that's very, very, very pathognomonic for celiac disease. But she suffered consequences when I was younger. She had a son, my brother, who was very iron deficient when he was born. And iron deficiency is a problem when you're born because your brain needs iron for development. So celiac disease, even though the prevalence is like 1% to 2% in population, it's still not screened for everyone in the population. So I'm not sure what'll happen with alpha-gal.
Yeah, I think when I read that quote from your guidance, my initial thought, I went to some of the tests you can have, say, for example, with my gynecologist, right? These tests that I could have to rule out my, that I might carry a gene for a certain illness. And there's part of me that thinks that if I didn't already know that I was alpha-gal positive, that I would want to know, even if I was asymptomatic, so that I could make the decisions about my diet and the impact it would have on my heart. It just gets you thinking. Obviously that it's a long road to figure out where it's going to go, but it brings in an entirely new conversation to the whole alpha-gal syndrome conversation that we're already having. I'd love to ask you to share with our listeners if they would like to hear more or learn more about what you're doing and the work that you're doing with alpha-gal syndrome. Where can they go to find that information?
That's a good question. Well, they can, I guess they can Google me.
They can click the links that we'll include in the show notes.
Yeah.
I haven't Googled myself a long time, but it's audacious for a physician because, anyone can like rate you and say something nasty online. But yeah, so I mean, we've published our research in medical journals, and some of those are behind paywalls and some of them aren't. I try to tweet everything that I publish, like the links. So you can look at like my Twitter history for links to the articles, and also kind of popular press coverage on GI alpha-gal as well.
Great. Thank you.
And yeah, we are just really grateful for all the work that you're doing and continue to pour into this community, because it's, like I said, this is so new, and you're really spearheading this whole education and research into the medical community. And it's fascinating. And we are definitely going to have to come back again as more things come out. And, is there anything last that you would like to share about anything upcoming research wise or any of that?
Well, we did get a grant from the American College of Gastroenterology. It's a pilot grant to study alpha-gal and GI symptoms. And we got one cooking at the NIH that, we're just crossing our fingers that might get funded too. But I think the patient community is really important, and also getting out the word. And I hope more gastroenterologists, and actually more doctors from like all the fields, right? Like emergency room doctors, they're seeing these patients, and internists and pediatricians, and we just all need to kind of raise awareness so doctors will be quicker to diagnose it, and also patients can know more about it too.
Right. Yeah. Well, we do really appreciate the work you're doing to raise awareness and just, help lead other people to find some solutions to relieving some of their symptoms. The last question that we have for you, Dr. McGill, we hear is the hardest question that we ask anybody, but we ask all of our guests that talk with us here on the podcast. And the reason we ask this question is because we at Two Alpha Gals talk a whole lot about joy all the time. And one of the ways that Candace and I personally find joy is through music. It's something that we enjoy with our families. We enjoy on our own. It doesn't cause a reaction. And so what we'd love to know is if there is a song or a musician or an artist or an album that brings you joy. And it can be in this moment, in a particular moment of your life, or for all time. So it's the spectrum of answers is wide.
It's fun. When you ask me that question, I just immediately think of Juan Luis Guerra. My husband's Colombian, and I've traveled a lot in Latin America, and he's a Puerto Rican singer, and he just has awesome songs, and they're so joyful. So Juan Luis, Guerra, it's great. His music's awesome.
Look that up.
Yep, I wrote it down too, so I could look it up too. We need some new joyful music in our lives, right, Candace?
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to talk with us. And I know that our community, the alpha-gal community, everyone listening is going to glean from this. And we just appreciate all of your hard work and dedication. And we cannot wait to talk to you again soon.
Awesome. Thank you, Candace. Thank you, Debbie. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us today on In the Tall Grass. Visit us at 2alphagals.com. That's TWO alphagals.com. Or you can find us on Instagram and Facebook at 2alphagals. If you enjoyed listening, please leave a review and help us grow this community.
We're all faced with obstacles on our journey, whether it be food allergies or tick-borne diseases. You might outgrow the reactions, but you won't outgrow the person you become. Ticks suck, but life doesn't have to.